"What are you two doing, Benny?" asked 10-year-old Violet Alden. She stood on the front steps of the old white house, watching her 5-year-old brother Benny and her 7-year-old cousin, Sue Lee Alden. Benny laughed. "We're practicing walking backward," he explained. Sue Lee nodded and added, "When we get good enough, we're going to have a walking backward race." "Benny, look out!" cried Violet. But it was too late. Benny had walked backward right into a pile of leaves. "Ah!" said Benny, falling down. Leaves flew up and scattered everywhere. Watch, the Aldens' dog, who had been lying on the grass, gave an excited bark and raced over to the pile of leaves. He jumped in too. "Look, Benny," said Sue Lee. "Watch thinks you're playing a game." She picked up a handful of leaves and threw them in the air. Watch leaped up and tried to catch them, barking the whole time. Violet smiled as she watched Benny and Sue Lee. Then Benny stopped. He looked down at the scattered leaves. "Uh-oh," he said. "These are the leaves that Henry and Jessie raked up this morning." Henry, who was 14, and Jessie, who was 12, were the oldest of the 4 Alden children. "Don't worry," called Henry. A moment later, he and Jessie came outside to join the others. "We can rake those up again in no time." "Yes, if we all do it together," said Violet. Benny jumped out of the leaves. "I'll get the rakes," he said. Benny hurried away and soon returned with the rakes. The 5 children set to work and soon had all the leaves in a big pile again. "Phew!" said Benny. "Jumping in the leaves was fun, but raking them up is hard work." "Are you hungry, Benny?" Jessie teased her brother. The others all laughed when Benny nodded. Benny was always hungry. Benny laughed too. "Yes," he answered. "I'm very hungry." "I think it's time for a snack," said Henry. "Come on." He led the way through the house to the big kitchen in the back. Mrs. McGregor, the housekeeper, was sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea with a curly-haired woman wearing a dark blue dress with a white collar. "Hello, children," said Mrs. McGregor, her cheerful face breaking into a broad smile. "This is a friend of mine, Mrs. Valentine. She's just come over to tell me the good news. Her niece Whitney is coming to visit." "She's a first-year student at college," said Mrs. Valentine. "I hope you'll all be able to meet her." Mrs. McGregor introduced the Aldens. "And Watch," added Benny quickly, pointing to the small terrier who was sitting at his feet. "And of course Watch," agreed Mrs. McGregor. Mrs. Valentine said hello to everyone and leaned over to pat the dog's head. "How do you do, Watch?" she asked. Watch wagged his tail happily. "He's a wonderful dog," said Mrs. Valentine. "Does he belong to you, Benny?" "No, we belong to him," said Benny. Violet nodded shyly. "It's true. He found us." As the Aldens got out cookies and milk, Sue Lee told how she had lived in Korea before Joe and Alice Alden, who were cousins of James Alden, had adopted her. Then Henry, Jessie, Violet, and Benny told the story of how the little dog had come limping into their lives when they first became orphans and were living in an old abandoned boxcar in the woods. Jessie had pulled the thorn from the little dog's paw, and Benny had named him Watch, and he had been a good friend and watchdog ever since. Now the old boxcar was in the yard behind the big white house where the Aldens lived with their grandfather James Alden. They hadn't known it when they were living in the boxcar, but he had been searching and searching for them. When he'd found them at last, he had brought them all to Greenfield to live with him. He'd even brought the boxcar, too, so they could visit it whenever they wanted. "What an amazing story," said Mrs. Valentine. "You know, it's funny, but I know a cat who found someone, too, sort of the way Watch found you." "Really?" said Violet, forgetting her shyness. "What happened?"